This is Ethics, Lecture 6, on John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is a philosopher who is most often contrasted with the philosophy, and ethical philosophy in particular, of Kant. And in many ways, there is a sort of either-or with respect to Mill or Kant. Whereas Kant, as we saw, claimed that it was the will that mattered, or intentions that mattered, and consequences don't matter as long as your will is good. For Mill, it's the other way around. It's the consequences that matter, and your will really only matters insofar as you will to bring about good consequences. Another issue with respect to Kant, and this was something that we saw at the end of the last lecture on Kant, is his commitment to universality. Because of his commitment to universality, it seems to lead Kant into some kind of extreme consequences in terms of his positions, that some issues just simply lead to consequences that one would not take to be moral, but fit Kant's view of universality. So that's something that people often will turn to consequentialism, which is another name given to the type of ethical philosophy that Mill puts forward, because in consequentialism, there is no universal set of laws or rules. One simply goes based upon a particular circumstance and what the best consequences will be in that circumstance. Whereas for Kant, it's what the principle of duty would have you do without exception. So it's very much a universal for Kant. So that's a big difference between consequentialism and the philosophy of John Stuart Mill on the one hand, and deontology, which is the name that's given for Kant's philosophy, and its emphasis on duty and universal moral law on the other. So this lecture we're going to focus on Mill's philosophy. And an important influence on John Stuart Mill is Jeremy Bentham. And you'll probably notice, if you're looking at this picture on the right, that you've got this figure sitting on a chair and this kind of old head sitting between his feet. Well, that's actually Jeremy Bentham's actual head, and the rest of the body is actually Jeremy Bentham's body too. In fact, he gave his body to the University College of London on condition that he continue to attend the board meetings. Well, they preserved his body, and he is now on display at the University College London. And he died in 1832. So that may be one thing you'll remember from this class. You may not remember much else, but Bentham was an eccentric character, to say the least. But he was best friends with John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill, and he and James Mill homeschooled John Stuart Mill. And so John Stuart Mill came under great influence of Jeremy Bentham. And in particular, they came under the influence of Jeremy Bentham's principle of utility. And Bentham states his principle of utility as follows. And this is in the text on the very first page of the Jeremy Bentham reading. And Bentham says, by utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. All this in the present case comes to the same thing. So in other words, what the principle of utility is saying is that we should act so as to maximize utility and minimize pain. In other words, maximize the most amount of pleasure, minimize the most amount of pain. Now, on the one hand, this might seem to be a pretty bad moral theory, because that's exactly what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a moral theory, because what if I get pleasure out of causing pain to people? That would seem to be something that would be justified by this theory. Or what if it's the night before a final exam and I get invited to a party? Well, that might seem to be more fun and bring more pleasure than studying for an exam. Well, Bentham was very much aware of these difficulties, and later on in the reading he lists 7 criteria for measuring utility. It's on page 316 of the 3rd edition of the Kahn and Markey textbook. And I'll just go through them very briefly. The first one is intensity. So if 2 pleasures are the same in all other relevant ways and only differ with respect to intensity, then that which is more intense is going to be the better one. So if you're at an amusement park you have time for one more ride, you probably do the one that brings the most intense pleasure. The second one is duration. Which one lasts longer will give more pleasure. Certainty or uncertainty. In other words, when you're thinking about doing something, this is the idea here. When you're about to do an action, you're trying to bring out a certain consequence, and you want to bring about the best consequences. Well, what are the odds of that consequence actually coming about? So if something has a greater certainty of bringing about a consequence than another action, that's another factor to be brought into consideration. Is propinquity or remoteness. How close or far away is the source of that pleasure, both in time and space? It's fecundity. In other words, what's the chance that that pleasure has of being followed by more pleasure? Or what's the chance it has of being followed by pain? And purity is kind of another version of that same idea. In other words, how likely is the pleasure will be followed by more pleasure? Going to a party the night before an exam is not a very pure pleasure because it has a good chance of being followed by the pain of doing poorly on the test, perhaps having to retake a class, and so on. And finally, the seventh criteria is the extent. This is the one that is most commonly associated with utilitarianism, and that is how many people are benefited by a particular action. There's a scene from a Star Trek movie where Spock says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And that's very much a utilitarian principle, that if you have a choice between doing an action that brings pleasure to just one person, namely yourself, and an action that has the potential to bring good to a good number of people, the latter one counts for more. So when it comes to measuring utility, Bentham was very much aware that there are complicating factors that come in. So this was Bentham's utilitarian theory, or his philosophy of ethics. And this is the philosophy that Mill was exposed to as a young man. And as he was growing up, he had heard and read about a number of criticisms of Bentham's philosophy. And I think the best way to understand and kind of get a handle on where Mill's coming from is to see how he responds to some of the critics of Bentham's philosophy. And that's going to be the main focus of this short lecture. So first off, in terms of response to Bentham's critics, the first and probably the most damning of the criticisms of Bentham is that he doesn't make a happiness-pleasure distinction. As we saw in the passage I read when I was talking about the principle of utility, he says happiness, pleasure, all this comes to the same thing. And the critics will say that this is a doctrine worthy of swine. It's a pig philosophy. In other words, whatever makes a pig happy is just as valuable or meaningful as whatever makes a human happy. In other words, pleasure, happiness, it's all the same thing. And so the idea here is that there are certain pleasures that are qualitatively better than other pleasures, and that no pleasure that a pig is capable of experiencing is on a par with the pleasure that a human being is capable of experiencing. Well, the question then is, well, what are these pleasures? And what Mill does is he basically resurrects the happiness-pleasure distinction that we talked about with Aristotle. In other words, for Aristotle, remember, happiness is something that we could only attain by exercising reason well and making good decisions. The same is going to be true for Mill, but as you'll see in the reading, he talks about how if we had a choice between being turned into a lower animal, no matter how many pleasures of the lower animal we were offered, let's say you're given the opportunity to become a chimpanzee, and you have all the pleasures a chimpanzee is capable of, would you choose to be turned into a chimpanzee? Mill's argument, and most of you probably would agree, and it's always good in a classroom setting that ask people to show of hands, and almost no one ever raises their hands. No one would want to be turned into a chimpanzee, no matter how many bananas or other pleasures you're capable of, because there's something qualitatively better about the pleasures you can have as a human being, even with all the stresses that you get as a human being. So this is why for Mill, he changes the principle of utility into the greatest happiness principle. And so he does recognize the criticism of Bentham's philosophy for not making a happiness-pleasure distinction, and his solution is very straightforward, that utilitarianism is not incompatible with the happiness-pleasure distinction. So he makes it in very much the same way that Aristotle does, though in the reading he doesn't refer to reason or rational deliberation like Aristotle does. He simply refers to our higher faculties. And part of the reason for that is that our higher faculties also entails aesthetic sensibility and things like that, which aren't particularly or necessarily rational in how they work. So that's the first problem that people often point to with Bentham and how Mill responds to it. The second problem that Mill brings up in the reading is that Bentham's philosophy is impractical. Before we do anything, we have to figure out which criteria fit, measure the criteria, go through all the possible scenarios, do this sort of moral calculus. Moral calculus is basically how we go about determining right from wrong and so on, and adding up the value and measuring of these utilities. And then after all that is done, after we've done all these calculations, gone through all the criteria and so on and so forth, then we are supposed to act. Well, what the critics argue is that this is impossible. It's just impractical. In some circumstances, we might be able to weigh pros and cons, but in most circumstances, it's highly impractical, and therefore Bentham's philosophy is good on paper, if that, they might argue, but in practice, we don't have the time, and we also don't always know what the consequences of our actions will be. Well, what Mill argues is that we have had time, all of the time of human history, to look at what generally works, or what, as a rule, has worked in the past. And this leads to a distinction in utilitarianism between what is called act and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism basically states that in each and every circumstance, do what brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, rule utilitarianism says that in a given circumstance, do what generally brings about, or as a rule, brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, obviously, it would be ideal if we could, in every circumstance, follow act utilitarianism. But this is where the criticism of Bentham and the impracticality comes in, because we can't always follow act utilitarianism. We don't have time to figure out all the consequences. We may not have all the knowledge of what the consequences may be. And so in a circumstance where it's unclear or uncertain, then it's best to simply do what in the past has worked. Follow the rule. But, and this is important for Mill, if there's an exception to the rule, then we resort back to act utilitarianism. This is where Mill's ethical theory is more realistic and flexible when it comes to its moral judgments. Where Kant would argue, for example, in the example that I gave, that if the woman comes over and you've hid her and her husband then comes over, whereas Kant would say you should tell the truth because that's your moral duty, and what he does should not affect your moral worth or value. What Mill would argue is that in this circumstance, maximizing the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people will be best served by not telling the truth, by sending him off through some sort of deception or something else. But telling the truth would not be the best thing to do in that particular circumstance. And so that's where the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism comes in. Now this leads to some problems with utilitarianism. In particular, the main problem is what counts as an exception. It could seem very easy to count something as an exception to a rule, and in fact, during World War II, Heinrich Himmler, one of Hitler's primary generals, the head of the SS, argued before a bunch of his own generals that the Holocaust, the final solution, was a necessary means to the greater end of Europe, even though it meant breaking the normal rule of causing death and suffering. So there seems to be then a clear utilitarian argument at work. Another example that one could point to would be involuntary organ donation. In other words, let's say a homeless person comes in and you could save 3 people's lives by taking out this person's organs. And the only way that those lives would be saved would be by taking out their organs. Does that justify taking out their organs? Most people would say no. But in a strict moral calculus, it would seem that that would be the thing to do. So these are just some of the many examples, and you should be able to come up with some examples of your own where you could see that justifying something in terms of utilitarianism could lead to justifying things that we see as obviously wrong. And so what the critics basically argue is that we need some sort of balance of utilitarian theory with Kant's more rigid rules. And sometimes following rigid rules without concern for the consequences turns out to be the right thing and the best thing to do. And so the debate between Kant and Mill reflects, I think, one of the more general aspects of ethics in particular, and that is integrity on the one hand, standing for principles and doing what is right and acting on duty, which is a point that Kant recognized and stressed. But then there's the utilitarian point that life is complex and we need to be sensitive to different scenarios and different situations, and our actions need to reflect what is best in those given circumstances. Ideally, I suppose we would look for some sort of balance between these two positions. And I think we might begin to find some sort of balance as we turn to Hume next.